Today, we are stepping onto one of the most iconic streets in America. We are looking at Fifth Avenue, but as a story about ambition, identity, and the ways architecture has been used to signal who belongs and who doesn't. In the late 19th century, Fifth Avenue became the stage for America's rising elite. Architects like McKim, Mead, and White weren't just designing homes, they were translating European aristocratic style for a new class of American wealth, shaping not only private lives, but public culture. But what makes Fifth Avenue so fascinating isn't just what was built there, it's what was lost. The mansions that once defined the avenue were in many cases demolished within a generation, replaced by apartments, hotels, and the commercial corridor we recognize today. Status shifted from ownership to access, from private homes to public presence. So, what does that tell us about the relationship between architecture and identity? I'm joined by architectural historian Mosette Broderick, author of Fifth Avenue, Architecture and Society, to explore how this single street can reveal so much about New York, about culture, and about the ways we construct and reconstruct who we are. This is a fascinating conversation, and I hope you enjoy. Welcome to Grandma's Silver, where tradition meets today. I'm Allie, your host of the Grandma's Silver podcast and founder of the Grand Millennial Lifestyle. Here, we blend aesthetics with nostalgia, engaging in conversations with lifestyle brands, designers, and more to rediscover the timeless charm of the past. Join me as we journey from home to heart, illuminating the past and polishing the present with the gleam of Grandma's Silver. Well, Mosette, I'm excited to chat today. This will be a very exciting conversation. As a history buff, why don't I turn this over to you and I'll allow you to first introduce yourself, and I think that will help folks to frame the rest of the conversation.
I'm Mosette Broderick, and I teach urban and architectural history at NYU and have now launched for some 16 years a program in adaptive reuse that's taught in England. It's not taught in America, it's taught in London. And I'm very happy to say we've had 16 classes graduate. And the idea of this program is that you might save a building, but what the heck do you do to make it pay? So we're not saving, we're reusing. And I've studied New York City architecture since the late 1970s. Originally, I studied English architecture, but it's very expensive to spend time researching abroad, and so I got switched into American. And I did a little book on the history of the Villard houses, which is now the Lotta Hotel in Manhattan. I was commissioned to do a book on McKim, Mead, and White, who were perhaps the most successful and certainly the largest American architecture firm of the late 19th and then early 20th century. Everything went through the McKim, Mead, and White office. So I did a book called Triumvirate. It sets them up as both human beings and architects. And that's my goal. I like to talk about the people, the clients, and the architects. So I do something that's really half social history and half architectural history. And that's what the new Fifth Avenue book does. It's just out in paperback. It's been sold out for a while, but it's out in paperback now. And it is a social and an architectural history. And it comes about because we learned rather late, I think, in the 1970s, that there are municipal records that architectural historians have never looked at. And there was something very special called the New York City docket books. And the docket books are 3-foot long ledgers, which start between 1866 and 1867. And in these ledgers, every builder and every architect came down to the buildings department once in a while and listed all their buildings, what they were going to do in the next months. And nobody had ever looked at them before. And when I looked at them, something that nobody will ever be allowed to do again, I spent 2 years looking at them, in the old Tweed Courthouse in New York City, which at that point leaked like a sieve and was filled with pigeons. So I spent a lot of my time waving away the pigeons and reading the docket. But I read every single building permit between the first day and 1910.
Wow.
That allowed me to see New York City develop, because this was a time when New York City was developing and Manhattan was moving to the north. So it gave me a chance to read and watch and envision the way the city was moving northward. One of the things that I noticed very quickly is Fifth Avenue was the lead. In rather like a pump or a magnet, Fifth Avenue and houses for the rich, and this is beyond New York, houses for wealthy people pulled Manhattan to the north a block at a time, a block a year, and that was the vacuum that pulled the city northward, with the middle class going out to the same area, but going out a little farther to the east and west, and less financially affluent people to the river's edge on those streets. So Fifth Avenue was the magnet that made Manhattan. You know, when old John Jacob, the original John Jacob Astor, died in 1847, he had been buying up empty farmland that is Manhattan today. And one of his regrets on his death years was that he had not bought every single farm that came up. He expected it to take 400 years for his heirs to assume all their properties be developed, and it happened within that very century. It was very fast because this is when immigrants are coming in. They're pushing people to the north also because they're settling in the lower part of the city, but they also provide labor. So it is the immigrants who are coming in at the Port of New York who are allowing the workmen who are doing these jobs to move forward. And so we watched Fifth Avenue grow. One of the things that's most remarkable about New York City is nothing stays the same very long. It might seem that by the middle and end of the 19th century, no place, no location in Manhattan was stable for more than 20 years. Manhattan looked like a leapfrog, jumping up to the new area all the time. It was said that the workmen in those 1 year spurts would take all the supplies they needed to build the speculative housing, which is mainly what they're building, fancy speculative housing in brownstones on Fifth Avenue, then palaces later on Fifth Avenue. It would seem that they took all the supplies and put them on the next block so that they'd be ready to go to the next site when building was finished. So the builders, who are more about the early part of the story than architects, actually enriched themselves. Many of the builders, if they were timed correctly for a real growth in Manhattan's luxury markets, if this were to happen, they became wealthy themselves, and they became clients for Fifth Avenue properties. The avenue begins, and New York City's history begins with a very simple fact. In the old days of what in New York is called the Knickerbocker Society, the merchants of the port, who were a very small number, 50, 100 people, ancestors of Edith Wharton, ancestors of Henry James, they mainly dealt with shipping trades around the world via the port on the East River, today known as South Street Seaport. These merchants of the port did very well, and they had an interesting society where they absorbed the Yankees. These are people from Boston who were also interested in business, or New England, I guess I should say, who are also interested in business, who come down because the Port of New York doesn't freeze. Unlike Boston or Newport or Philadelphia, which freeze, New York didn't. And so the Yankees joined the Knickerbockers, and they kind of jammed together. And in the early years, they took on Knickerbocker Dutch society rules. Those rules meant that they didn't do Christmas very much, but they did a big New Year's. And all the men of the era would go to visit all the homes of the era, and the wives would be all dressed up, expecting the gentlemen to come through, and they'd offer them a cup of fancy alcohol-laden punch, Madeira-laden punch. And I think the men of the era must have been really, really drunk by the end of the day. There was also a conformity. Everybody now was living in a brownstone fronted house. It's the same house as the federal Georgian houses. It just has a brownstone veneer instead of the brick. But everybody lived in the same house. Everybody wanted the same thing. Everybody looked alike. Everybody had the same customs, and they were pretty simple. If you got a fancy dress, the idea was that women would not wear it for 2 years. If you wanted to celebrate a holiday, what you would do is dance at the edge of the park. If you want young men and young women to socialize, they either did so in the back gardens of their brownstones, their row houses, or on the edges of the park. Young people courting would dance at the top of City Hall Park, then at the top of Washington Square Park. It was very simple. It was very repetitive. And the great treat were ginger snap cookies. So it is into this world that new money comes. right around and just after the Civil War. And the new money found that nobody from the old world, the Knickerbockers, wouldn't accept them. And they wanted acceptance. And so what they do is build palaces. The role of the house is important in the 19th century. What's important to indicate wealth today? A yacht, a Rolex, fancy handbag. In the early 19th century, the role of the house was to show you were a successful businessman. And because you didn't trust anybody in the first half of the 19th century, your family were your employees. So everything was done in that brownstone. By the Civil War, when we get these people crawling at the edges of the established group of Knickerbocker socialites, we see that the role of business going downtown and being separate from home life appears. This appears at the same time that women, because there's so many immigrants coming in, get a big staff help at home, and labor saving devices are coming in. So women can engage in social climbing and plotting. And that is one of the big efforts in the second half of the century, when all of that conformity goes out the window. And the new goal becomes how to make our new houses show off as much as possible.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what they did. How do you buy your way in? Well, you build a really fancy house. And if you're really smart, you put a hoarding or you put a fence around it so everybody wonders what's going on there. And you sort of let them know that there may be gold fittings in the bathroom. The newcomers to high society break their way in the 1870s. And this involves parties where no expense was spared. And this involves building palatial-like homes and also starting to contemplate Europe as you now feel yourself to be an American aristocrat, whatever that is, take on and enter European society. And so we come to an era in which many wives, and the most notorious of them, although there were 300 of them, but the most notorious was Alva Smith Vanderbilt, the wife of Willie K. Vanderbilt, who took her tall daughter, whose life she'd kind of ruined as a child, and married her off to the ninth Duke of Marlborough. This was a triumph for Alva, and marrying a European nobleman got the newcomers, the new wives of the well-to-do people into New York society, because who could deny your daughter's married to the Duke of Manchester, who turns out to be a crook, and a lot of other things, but the title worked. Mm-hmm. And so what we see here is a great change. And we see something like 300 American girls going to Europe. All of these marriages were very clear-cut. The women knew what they were getting, and the men knew it as well. They were unhappy marriages. There's only one marriage that seems to have been the least bit successful, and that was the Golette daughter, who seems to have had a real happy time. No one else did. The minute the heir and the spare were produced, as Consuelo did, she fled. Right after the coronation of Edward VII, she fled and managed to establish sort of a life for herself, which she in Surrey, and then later in Paris, where she marries a French pilot. And this requires a divorce. No, an annulment, because the new husband was came from a family of devout Catholics. And so Consuelo had to get her mother to say what she did to her, which was probably pretty true. And that is that the mother feigned a heart attack, did all sorts of things to force Consuelo, who had a boyfriend, and the ninth Duke, who had a girlfriend, to go through with the marriage, which involved basically $3 million of New York Central stock, which was given to the ninth Duke. So these marriages were unfortunate. Consuelo had been groomed for it since childhood. Her mother put her in a steel brace she invented, so that her neck was tall and thin. And when you look at the Singer Sargent painting of Consuelo and the ninth Duke, you see exactly what Alva did to the daughter. She made her fluent, and she was a bright woman. She made her fluent in languages, perfect German, perfect French. She did the things a woman of importance was meant to do as a wife of importance.
Wow.
And it was all over. Alva and her mother became leaders in the suffrage movement. Alva actually financed much of the women's suffrage movement. What a turnaround. So what is the role of the houses? The role of the houses established a coarse Staten Island farmer called Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt. He never actually tried to build. He was a Knickerbocker era person, so he never tried to have a grand house. But his grandchildren did. And so what this does is make us know who the Vanderbilts are. And it makes us think the Vanderbilts were important people. They hadn't been. They established it for themselves. And somebody as coarse as the original John Jacob Astor, who wanted to buy up all the farms, he was a guy who, when desperate immigrants came by with accordions to, and a monkey to try to play on the streets of the wealthy people needing a small amount of change, he'd shoot at them with not real bullets, but what do you call that? Those guns that shoot powder. He was really a nasty man, a man whose staff took him out to the street every afternoon as he fell aged and ill, and literally took a heavy blanket and tossed him up in the air to keep bed sores from coming. And yet we think of the Astors as a very grand family today.
Mm-hmm.
And it is the house that did it.
Can I ask a question? And I don't mean because this is so fascinating and I'm so enthralled by all of this, but one of the things you hit on was this idea that, we really didn't know who the Vanderbilts were until, the house kind of told society that they were somebody, right?
That's right.
And you also touched on earlier this concept of McKim, Mead, and White. They were really the architects of the American Gilded Age, as you said. They're designing for the ultra wealthy. I'm going to try to formulate this question right, but one of the things that I'm curious about is it sounds like Fifth Avenue was really farmland.
Oh, it was.
That
all of
yeah, so it's this farmland that folks pushed out into. So which kind of came first? Was it this social demand for a prestigious address, or was it the architects that kind of helped define like what this looked like?
A lot in this time period, the people who were building the new buildings had really no knowledge of architects per se.
Okay.
Often aggressive, coarse people. The next generation would. It was Alva Vanderbilt who brought the established great early 1850s New York architect Richard Morris Hunt forward for her marble or her white stone palace on Fifth Avenue. Most of the houses had been built by builders.
Okay.
Most of them. And many of the fancier houses were built by builders. Some of them now speculators. So there's a couple of houses opposite the Metropolitan Museum today that were speculatively built by developers. Four of them were built. One of them is the house opposite the Met that's in a bag now, but the Carlos Slim had owned it. Fifth Avenue is gone. Fifth Avenue itself has very few of the houses, hundreds of houses, and they're all gone. And I could never find, I always wondered, what did they say when their house goes down? What did the three children of Alva Vanderbilt stay when the Vanderbilt mansion on 51st Street there, the Petit Chateau, she called it. What did they say when it went down? Did anybody say, gee, I'm sorry to lose my childhood home? There seems to be nothing. Nobody cared. By then, they had sold their businesses to corporations. They had children in Europe. They were living in Greenwich or other places, and they didn't see any need for the New York City house anymore. So it has this amazing history of pulling New York City to the north, being the only game in town to get you well noticed and forgotten about.
Yeah.
20 years after you did it. New York has one of the shortest memories for buildings of any city. The building where George Washington took the oath of inauguration was pulled down in 15 years.
Wow.
Only New York would do that. And so that's basically what happens. By the time we get to the end years of the 19th century, J.P. Morgan has come back from England and has set up what is today the J.P. Morgan business. And what he does is facilitate the sale of family companies that had gotten huge, like New York Central. So for the Vanderbilts, he corporatized it. U.S. Steel for Frick and Carnegie and those people. J.P. Morgan turned it into a stock company. So you didn't need the house. You didn't need the image anymore. Everybody knew about you now. And the reason everybody knew about you now is gossip in the newspapers. Today, look at the newspapers today. They're always filled with actors or celebrities or musicians. In the 19th century, it was filled with the antics of the wealthy in the Gilded Age. The wives often supplied it. If they didn't supply it, servants in the household did. And so they followed Alva Vanderbilt's wedding for her daughter, attended by everybody except the Vanderbilts, who she didn't invite, having divorced Willie K. Vanderbilt a year or two earlier. Everybody knew every detail of her trousseau. They knew everything about it, except she cried through the whole darn thing. because she'd been forced into something she didn't want.
Mm.
So, but that was not reported. The glamour, the expenses, and then a sort of funny, eccentric woman who was married to a fish, one of the old New York families, Hamilton and other fishes. This was Mamie Fish. And what she did was bring in entertainers. Gradually, that shifted the focus at the same time that they were no longer using the Fifth Avenue houses. It shifted the focus to celebrities in the news, not the
Okay.
antics of the well-to-do class. That's really basically what happens. Then, as you probably have guessed, the properties, if 20 years, this is a hot place to live. But one of the things you said about those old Yankee merchants who couldn't keep up with the money of the Vanderbilts, they were known as soiled doves. And they still lived on modest, what was now modest sums in the brownstones of lower Manhattan, which survived amazingly until the 1920s. That area survived, but the area above 14th Street is where the push comes. What happens there is that the families begin to spend less time in the houses. Employees are an issue. Lots of people are coming in from the immigration rates. They would go down to the Docklands when the docks were still at what is today the Battery. And what they would do is interview people to come to work in the houses. The new employees might say, well, are you in a house? And realize it had a lot of stairs and a lot of expectations. But there's something brand new with places like the Dakota, and that's the apartment. So if you found out the people might have an apartment, yeah, the employee would go to the apartment, of course. And then there were issues of theft. There were some spectacular silver and jewelry robberies in the summer, which turned out often to be in-house deals. Gradually, they didn't need these houses anymore. The business had been sold. It was a corporation. They were located somewhere else. Their grandchildren were in Europe. And so gradually, in 1916, there's a law change, and that is going to allow taller buildings to be built on Fifth Avenue. And suddenly, unlike the area where the soiled doves were, suddenly your brownstone or your palace, the land was worth much more than the house. And so you abandoned the house and it was torn down.
Mm-hmm.
And in the late teens and then the 20s, a lot of apartment houses replaced the houses. And Fifth Avenue houses were passe. At the same time, too expensive to keep up to. And at the same time, something new that is an American creation, and that is the tall office building, comes in. The developers of the tall office buildings wanted some Fifth Avenue property too. And so in the first years of the 20th century, on what was, I think, 52nd Street, a developer wanted to build a 9-story building, the Dutton Building, a prestigious office building. And the Vanderbilts and the Astors and the Rockefellers fought it because the 9-story building is going to cast a shadow on their gardens at the back of their house, and it's going to ruin their gardens. And they at first tried to buy them out and build some more luxury row houses speculatively to rent out. It didn't work very well. And so by 1909, the first tall building of a commercial nature is built on Fifth Avenue. And Benjamin Altman, who lived on Fifth Avenue by now with his great art collection, he died in 1913. But what he did was create a big department store on 34th Street. The building is still extant, B. Altman and Co. And so suddenly Fifth Avenue becomes the street for the grand department stores and some office buildings. And all of a sudden, Midtown is overrun with commercial properties. And the people who wanted a quiet house had moved way uptown to the upper 80s and Carnegie Hill, where they remained through the 1960s until Grandma died. And that was the end of the row house. Tom Wolfe, the great writer, in his tangerine-colored something flake baby, that great book of the 1960s, talks about this and about how the nannies in the 1950s and 60s who were in charge of the birthday party for their charges went up to Carnegie Hill to Grandma's house because they were embarrassed to let the other nannies know that they lived in an apartment. And I remember this. This really happened. Fifth Avenue just dies an unhappy death. After all the showing off that they had, which established their fame, and they brought in the gossip columns. After all of this happened, suddenly the ministry took a moral viewpoint. and said, wait a second, you guys are spending millions, not millions, you're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on a party. There was the famous Bradley Martin ball at the brand new Van Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and the Bradley Martins had to go live abroad because the notoriety for that big party had so damaged their reputation that they left the country. It's over. And in a way, it killed Manhattan as well, because society as it existed had the families who had established themselves in that era limped on with something called the New York Social Register, which continued until, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago. And people would come in for coming out parties, which also ended about that time. So it was all over by the middle of the 20th century. And Fifth Avenue was gone. It was a series of apartment houses from the 20s, and then the rest of them in the 1950s. And there's almost nothing left. Where in the world could you see something with that stellar history? All those great buildings. Did we save any of them? Shouldn't Alva Vanderbilt's Petit Chateau have been saved? The William Collins Whitney establishment on 67th Street on an old house of the Steam King Stuart, and the Havemar House with its Tiffany falling staircase and its huge number of great paintings Mary Cassatt bought for the Havemars. Shouldn't those three houses have been preserved? Nothing was.
We have to talk about that more in a minute. I do have a quick question because I don't want to lose this thought in the context that we're talking about it. You mentioned the apartments.
Right.
And sort of this evolution of the apartment, taller buildings. We now also know, obviously, Fifth Avenue is associated with luxury branding. My first question is, did living in those Fifth Avenue apartments come with any of the same clout did Fifth Avenue maintain its
No.
clout the way that? No.
Not by World War II.
Okay.
The last of the houses, Jock Whitney, the last of the houses about in 1947, it just meant money.
Okay.
You had to have a lot of money to rent to live on Fifth Avenue, but the clout was gone. And down in Midtown, something arose which really showed the end of the retail trade too. By the middle of the 20th century, by the 1950s, there was the perennial going out of business store, a store which had replicas of chandeliers and Chinese vases and all sorts of luxury goods made somewhere, God knows where, but all reproductions and sold cheap. So you had this permanently going out of business Fifth Avenue junk shops, basically. And those continued almost to the present day. So it trashed the idea that when the department stores, when Altman failed, and then it was followed fairly quickly by Lord & Taylor's, and now Saks Fifth Avenue very recently limped along longer than most. Bergdorf Goodman is threatened. So luxury retail, as we know it, isn't a department store anymore.
Yeah.
I personally believe that the department store, as we know it in America, was created by German Jewish dry goods entrepreneurs of the 19th century, who bumped up their dry goods shop into what would become Kaufmann's of Pittsburgh or Bergdorf Goodman or any of these stores. But now luxury trade is in small shops, Gucci shops or Hermes shops or something like that, often in a shopping mall. Fifth Avenue as a address and as a retail address, and maybe even as a business office address, is gone. It had a very ignoble, the comparable issue might be Park Lane in London, which also developed in the 19th century for nouveau riche people who were not part of the aristocracy, Germans, South Africans, Jewish entrepreneurs. And so Park Lane had a whole bunch of these grand houses, and they went down quickly after the First World War as fine hotels. That's the only street, but it didn't have the cheapening. Regent Street as a street that united, but that's a different story. So the cheapening of retail trade also killed Fifth Avenue. So to me, I go down it. Often I take the bus down Fifth Avenue. It used to clog up at Fifth Avenue store areas, and it would be filled with you couldn't proceed very well because so many people were shopping and walking and viewing the street, and now you just sail through. Some of the artistic treasures, many of the paintings ended up in the Metropolitan Museum that people bought in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So they found a home. The interiors in general did not. People bought bits and pieces of it. Ringling of circus fame in 1926 spent some time in New York buying the contents of houses as they were, as the palace houses, as they were being torn down. So the Ringling Museum in Florida has a fair amount of the interiors of some of these houses, but in general, it just went and was forgotten.
Sorry, I'm kind of bouncing around here, but you're mentioning these palace houses is I think the term you used. So as far as architecture goes, because I think a lot of them, at least I know with McKim, Mead, and
Yeah,
White, right? Like they were sort of
didn't do a lot.
taking European aristocratic style, adapting it. So architecturally, were these giant houses, these mansions on Fifth Avenue during that Gilded Age period very similar architecturally, or was there competition to
There
outdo
was
one?
competition.
Yeah,
You
okay.
get on target. They wanted everyone. I want to stand out, so I'm going to make mine with some Spanish roofs. Not much coming from Spain at that time. It wasn't prime an area, but that is exactly right. Alva
Mm.
Smith started it when she married Willie K. Vanderbilt and builds the Petit Chateau on 50th Street or 51st Street, which is a French Loire chateau out of what was said to be French marble, but was really Indiana's great limestone, Bloomington, Indiana limestone. But that was the first one. And it's beached on a Fifth Avenue street when it should be on the Loire. It should be on a river in France. She stands out, right? Nobody built a house like that. After that, you did the stately English house. You could do an Italian palazzo. Oddly enough, McKinney and White had sort of peaked. It was their apprentices and their employees, Carrera and Hastings, and other architects who kind of took over the Fifth Avenue trade. So McKinney and White did some, but actually they were doing public buildings, museums, and Morgan Library. They were doing bigger deal stuff and less private housing at that point. But the houses were clashing with each other in order to stand out. So you say, oh, that's the X house or the Y house. It enabled the wife often
Hmm.
to climb herself into an acceptable place that flattered her immensely. One of the great tragedies of this was on 87th Street and Fifth Avenue, the Phipps, Phipps, the Phipps house. Mr. Phipps' ancestors were shoemakers from Scotland who came to Pittsburgh when Carnegie did from Scotland. But the Phipps ended up as extremely wealthy people. And they bought property on 87th Street. They're moving up block by block. They bought property on 87th Street in the early 20th century and built a really fine house with a carriage ride. And to protect himself, what Mr. Phipps did is buy the neighboring properties. This is what Carnegie does. There's a whole story in there about protecting properties, which is complicated and needs another talk. But what Phipps did was buy the properties that surrounded him on Fifth Avenue so he could control who came in as his neighbors.
Hmm.
But he made a mistake. He didn't think to buy East. He didn't think to buy Madison Avenue. And so a decade after he finished his house, which is the highest level of the new houses, an apartment house went up on Madison and 87th Street and cast a shadow into his greenery, and that house went down. And parts of it are in Old Westbury Gardens, a country house that Phipps and his son built in Westbury, but it went right down. So the lifetime of these houses was like 20 years.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit more because this is mind-boggling. Was there just no concept of preservation at this point, or were the houses not actually seen? Were the houses not seen as historically significant because it was more about posturing? Like, why was this just such a okay thing to do?
It's money.
Okay.
It's not in Phipps's case, because he
Yeah.
already had it. But for many of the well-to-do people whose houses were on 86th or 85th, were on the other street, suddenly your 25 by 100-foot plot is worth millions.
Mm.
So isn't it better for you? No reason you don't need the house because it is the house as a social vehicle is over.
Yeah.
Your business is no longer yours. It's a corporation. So the house makes no sense at all. And you could tear down your house once there's something called New York City zoning issue in 1916, and there's a big one on Fifth Avenue. The Fifth Avenue Association, a group of soiled doves in Lower Manhattan, had put it in. And it said you couldn't build a new building that was more than 1.5 times the width of the avenue. Once that was removed, and the Supreme Court allowed that to be moved,
Mm.
Everybody ditched their house in favor of raw cash.
Wow.
New York City doesn't do preservation. We still don't. We had a very fine when Penn Station and other buildings of importance started to go down after World War II. The New York City itself came up under Mayor Wagner with a preservation law in 1965, 67. It was absolutely chicken, whatever, of doing anything serious. One of the great houses, the Leonard Jerome House, the house of Jenny Jerome, mother of Winston Churchill, the grandest house built in its day in 1859 on Madison and 23rd Street, was up before the Landmark Commission. Gone. Metropolitan Opera Company, rebuilt in the early 1890s as a grand Parisian styled, like the Opera in Paris. Gone. So the early Landmark Commission had no teeth. There is a brief period where they try in the 70s and 80s. Right on 43rd and 5th right now is going to be one of the tallest buildings in the world. On 47th Street in the Diamond District, where formerly immigrants who did craft work and jewelry had their little tiny shops and the trade flourished for the United States. They're getting an Extel, huge building on 47th Street that's in construction right as we speak. It's money. New York always was. I mean, that's what allowed the robber barons to come
Right.
in and do it. It's always the lure of huge amounts of money. If you are a fancy person, you could crash society in Palm Beach or Houston a lot easier than New York. So we've lost this. We've lost this. I remember when I was a child, I had some experience of it, but those people are, none of them are here anymore, which is very bad, which is why the Metropolitan Opera and the Metropolitan Museum, etc., have lost their patrons.
You're
So,
touching on something important, and I think preservation is going to circle back here in a second, but I don't want to miss the opportunity to kind of ask about, obviously, the intersect, right, of what the architecture can inform about society.
at the time, it changes. I don't think architecture informs the way it once did. In the 19th century, when you needed to have a house that showed you why would I invest in your company? You're new. I don't know you. The railroad business you're hawking is new and I don't really understand it. Having a substantial house showed investors that you were worth the risk.
Mm.
That if you had a house like that, surely they could invest in your company and be successful. In the Villard story, for example, he was building that palace and the railroads went under. And it actually hurt him because when the railroad went bankrupt halfway through the house, or 9/10 of the way through building the Villard houses that are part of the Lotta, they're the front only of the Lotta Hotel that they went down. Leona Helmsley pulled the hotel down in the 1970s. When Villard did it, he was harassed in front of the house. The public who lost their investment in his railroads, the Northern Pacific, came to the house and said, "You live like that and you lost all our money." So the houses could be a liability as well as an asset, but it was the upkeep cost, its service people, etc. So nobody cared. And they went down there. I'm almost done. There is a man that one of the sort of figures in New York City behind the scenes efforts at preservation and zoning is a man called Anthony C. Wood. And Anthony Wood just wrote a book on a man called Bard, who most of us don't know anything about at all, who lived to great old age and did by himself dangerously for his own health, save buildings. He saved the Boundary. He was a very important figure in preservation, but we don't do preservation very seriously. And as I was saying earlier, we let it go.
Yeah, the Street of Dreams is kind of ironic, I guess.
That's right. I guess they were illusions. And this is even true I teach at NYU. NYU was in the middle of the old soil doves world. It was in the middle of Yankee houses, which were built in the 1830s and maybe early 1840s by merchants of the port and resided in through their deaths by their widows. And their widows all die about 1891, 92. And in comes the brand new fashion business,
Okay.
ready-made clothing,
Yep.
and 12 new loft buildings for the manufacture of attire, clothing, feathers, stoles, hats, comes into those old houses, and the winners were all just dead. So let's buy two or three of the houses and we put up a loft building. And so NYU has taken over these buildings. So the loft builder, a German immigrant to the United States in the 1880s, becomes the unofficial architect of NYU because he built the 12 loft buildings that NYU now has much of their operation in. And the building of these new loft buildings actually pushed some of the soil doves up north because the people who worked in those factories were brand new immigrants, women mainly. The men owned them,
Hmm.
but they were Italian, Southern Italian, and Eastern European women who
Okay.
formed bonds of friendship. And is today the day? Today, maybe even anniversary, within a day or two, of the Great Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in the building on Washington Place, where a manager of the sewing teams who were working on, I think it was the ninth floor, I may be wrong, in this building at the time for the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, blouse company, he locked the door behind him and went out, and a spark fell on the fabrics, and a fire ensued, and the door was locked, and the fire was raging, and these women, a huge, well over 100, and jumped out the window to certain death.
Mm.
This is why the fire department now mourns. They bring a big wreath, and there's now a monument. But the thing I always like to mention about this is the soiled doves left because these people brought their own food. And the Italian food and the Eastern European food to them smelled. Wasp food in those days was boiled. Didn't smell at all. It had no flavor at all. But these people brought in ethnic foods, and
Hmm.
that's what pushed them north. It's heartbreaking, but that led to labor laws and leads to the 1916 zoning law. So there's changes. The rapidity of change in New York is something that you just can't imagine.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I've never thought about New York. I don't know if destruction is the right word, but this constant reinvention,
It's
maybe.
always,
Even these elite spaces are getting replaced, is more so what I'm trying to say. But that lack of preservation, and just you pointing out that it's sort of cyclical.
yep,
Was this really the first example of this happening? This Gilded Age mansion, demolish? I
in
guess
the
my
United
question
States.
is it inevitable? Was that inevitable, or was that really the first,
What was
the
what was crazy?
kickoff?
What was crazy about it? In the old days, in the Knickerbocker world, Edith Wharton's ancestors left the country because the old merchants of the port were driven out of business by European scheduled shipping routes. And they didn't have anything left except their house. And they rented it out for money and went to live abroad. So they live in Prussia. They live in Pau in France. They live in Dresden in great number, and to some degree Paris. So what we see is the first group of American casualties of changes in a more rapidly growing business world when they flee New York, living on the rent from their house in the cheaper world of Europe. This great change, though, takes place gradually because of something called the income tax. The government survived on customs revenues, which was a problem. You can ask J.P. Morgan and bringing art in, which had a high tax for many years. The income tax rears its head in the 1890s. And a lawyer called Joseph Choate, who does wonderful houses. He commissioned McKimmey and White, wonderful house in the Berkshires. He was an enlightened patron. And Joseph Choate, for the robber barons, fought the income tax until finally in 1913 it came in. And at that point, the very wealthy families faced property taxes, which they'd always had, but now an income tax. And that's the impetus that gets John D. Rockefeller Jr., the son, willing to let all the properties he owns around his house on 54th Street go because now they've got income tax as well as property taxes.
Hmm.
And his brain trust says you can't do this anymore. So it was economic reality after 1913. But now we have one or two really super rich, but we don't have this retinue of Gilded Age figures that we once had.
With what you know about architecture and society and that, do you see any sort of equivalent, a modern equivalent, or do you feel like it's
No,
it's
it's going another route. Architecture is not what it was. Maybe it is for corporations. Google has this fancy new building in London, King's Cross, that's about to get employees this summer. For corporations like Google that want an identity, Apple certainly uses architecture in their shops.
yeah.
very brilliantly. The one in Paris, which is an old the adaptive reuse with some modern intrusions. They do. But does it work for you and me? Does it work for regular people? No. Does it work for very wealthy people? Well, to some degree. If you look at Palm Beach or Beverly Hills, we can see some of it, but it doesn't convey the message the way it once did. In fact, the fancy houses in Palm Beach and the fancy houses in Beverly Hills, you sell it because it was the home of Marilyn Monroe, or so it's all based on the person who lived there, not the style of the building. What you do now to stand out is to have 8 houses and a yacht and the mandatory Rolexes or whatever. It doesn't Architecture doesn't work the way it used to. We can hope some corporations do. We can hope some institutional buildings, should government buildings, should urban buildings, or by that I mean urban government buildings, should we pay attention to the way they look? Yes. But I think the role of architecture is now caught up in housing, affordable housing, social housing. Shouldn't we be worried less about that and more about getting the huge homeless people, a population in a building? Architects should be using their skills right now, not for the ultra wealthy.
But it feels like this Fifth Avenue book was sort of in conversation with your Triumvirate book. Because,
Yes,
and so do you feel like having dived into all of this so much, has it inspired or trickled into additional research projects or areas of study?
yeah, yeah. I'm working right now on two projects, 3 projects actually. I should be crazy. I'm working on now the first American invention of art, the first time America stops following what they're doing in high circles in Europe
Hmm.
is after the Civil War, the 1870s, when we also do something new, which was stop living our summers in our garden behind our row house, but we're starting to go to resorts.
Interesting.
And what do so we're creating Long Branch, New Jersey, Elberon, New Jersey. Then we're going to go to Newport and Narragansett, Seal Harbor, places where you go in the summer to avoid the heat. And we're building a special kind of wooden architecture that's filled with breezes only for summer. So it's filled with breezes and open porches and wooden architecture that is the first time that Americans invent their own style. It's not something they're doing in Europe. We invent it, although it's based, as with everything we do at the time, it's based on Europe. So
Yeah.
what we're doing is the American robber barons are now beginning to travel to France. And at that point in France, the industrial class who they identified with were going to Normandy. They haven't figured out the south of France yet. So they're going to Normandy, a place where it's cold and rains, but in the summer. Why in the world they did that, I don't know. But I'm kidding. This is Deauville and Trouville. And Dieppe in my case. And so the Americans are going there. And so they're picking up the shapes of farm complexes and they're creating this asymmetrical, wonderful wooden architecture that's America's first architecture on its own, even if it's based on European prototypes put together in a jigsaw puzzle kind of way. And what did we do with it? The same thing we did with Fifth Avenue. We burned it down in the 1930s. So there's almost nothing left. But there's some great examples in Newport. Elberon took down everything. It coincides with something Stanford White is doing in New York at the time, which is something called the free classical style, where he too decides for the Judson Memorial Baptist Church on the south of Washington Square, he's not going to copy what the latest church design is in Europe, but he's going to put together a montage of buildings he's actually looked at. Mantua, Rimini, he's putting together parts of buildings by himself. He's creating what is kind of an assembly of parts of European buildings, and he does that in a sort of tawny Roman bricks material, and that is called the free classical style. So it's when Americans are starting to get independent. So that's what I'm working on at the moment, although I'm also looking into where they got the dealers that no art dealers in America until the well-to-do Palace era. And then we get art dealers, and where are they getting it from? Heavily Florence, from a man called Stefano Bardini, who went, as they tore down the center, the old medieval and early Renaissance core of Florence, he went every day after the work had been done and bought the demolition products. And that's J.P. Morgan's library. That's the interior of many of these houses. So I'm hoping this summer to get a quick trip to look. They've opened up now Bardini's records. So I want to see what robber barons went there and who didn't.
Well, Mosette, this was wonderful. As a history buff, this was one of those things that's long been on my list to try and understand, but I did not. And so I appreciate you taking the time to there's still more to learn and to know, but this is such a good overview. And now I have 1,000 more questions that I'm eager to go find the answers to. But thank you for taking the time to be here and to fill everybody in today.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed, as I always do, I enjoyed talking about it. Thank you very much for asking me.
Thank you. Have a good one.
You too.